have a wonderful evening for you. And as it's titled up here, why wait for failure? The earlier the intervention, we all know the better the outcome. So we have a terrific evening, and this is Lawrence School. You're at our upper school campus. We have two campuses. This is our grades 7 through 12, and we also have a lower school campus over in Broadview Heights, and that's grades kindergarten through 6, where we also have our Ethan D. Schaefer for Center for Learning Differences, and Dr. Kelly Christian, who is our clinical director, is going to kick us off this evening, and we have plenty of staff around. So should you have any questions about Lawrence School or really anything about learning differences, our staff is here to answer any questions for you. So without any further ado, Dr. Kelly Christian.
Thank you, Doug. All right, first, I just want to give a thanks to the Bicknell Fund. Their generous grants are what allow us to provide these community education events for free several times a year. And tonight is no exception. We're fortunate to have Mr. Earl Oremus here to talk about the science of reading development, how to identify reading problems early, and then what can be done to prevent reading failure. Before our program starts, I just want to give you a heads up about your folder. On the right-hand side, you'll find a copy of all the slides printed out. And underneath that is the program evaluation form. That's an important form for us in the Schaefer Center because we like to take a look at your thoughts on each event, and it'll help us plan for future events. Okay, so if you could, we will remind you at the end too, please complete that form so that we get a good idea about what you liked about our event so that we can move ahead with events that are similar to today. Now I have the privilege of introducing you to Mr. Earl Oremus. He's in his 50th year as an educator, curriculum designer, and school leader. In 2015, he retired as headmaster of Marburn Academy in Columbus, Ohio. That's a private school that caters to children with learning differences and educates them with evidence-based teaching strategies. He also spearheaded the nation's first school-based, community-wide free reading screening clinic, which we admired here at Lawrence and have been doing it now for the last 10 years out of our lower school. Since retiring, Earl has served as headmaster emeritus at Marburn Academy. He speaks regularly at regional and national conferences, and he's also a consultant for teacher training, parent advocacy groups, and school district leaders on science-based reading instructional methods. Okay, so if you can, help me welcome Mr. Earl Oremus to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You get that one, I have this one. So delight to be here with you tonight, and our topic is why wait for failure. It's built around the idea that lots of times when kids struggle in school, they do get some help eventually, but by the time they get it, an awful lot of water has gone over the dam or under the bridge or whichever one of those things you prefer. And it just makes it that much harder. So the big question then is, why would we have to do that? Okay, so these are the 4 pieces we're going to look at. And the first one is to acquaint you with the research base, which is really vast and profound here. And I guess I was thinking about this afternoon, the whole point of this one is I'm trying to use this data to convince you that I'm not making this stuff up. That this is stuff that has been thoroughly researched for 35 years, and the results have been the result of hundreds of studies that are scientifically designed, so we have good information here. Okay, so then we're going to take a look at from a technical point of view and from a brain point of view, what are the actual steps in learning how to read, what takes place there. Next, we're going to look at when kids have reading problems, what's the source of those problems so we can understand where it comes from. And then finally, what is all this evidence that we have from the research? What does it say to us about the chances we have of preventing reading failure, or if reading difficulty occurs, of fixing the problems so that problem is not an issue any longer. Okay, so here we are. I'm going to spend a lot of time actually here. Am I okay if I wander around this way? Am I doing it? Okay. I'm going to spend some time talking about the research because there are millions of studies in the field of education. The problem is that most of them have too few students in them. They have an average N of 40. So if you're thinking about how to develop national policy or policy for a school district, would you want to base that on 40 kids? Well, no. So that's a problem with it. They actually don't last long enough. Most of them are done by graduate students, so they can't get it going until October in their master's year, and then they have to finish it up by March, so it only goes for about 6 months, so you look at a very few kids for a very short period of time. That's not likely to produce actionable research. Most are not designed to the highest standards of experimental science. Most of them are descriptive studies that actually don't produce clear science about do this instead of that, or vice versa. They also lack large replication studies. So in really serious science, one study, the findings of one study don't qualify as science. What you need is, if you did your study in Dallas, you need somebody in Denver to do it, follow exactly your protocol, and do it with their children, exactly the way you did it, and find the same results. Then you need somebody in Portland to do that, somebody in New York, somebody in Savannah. Now you have converging results from many studies in different places by different people using the same protocol, and they all tell you the same thing. So now you have something that you can put your trust in. This is different from a research finding. It's science. Okay, so we say that most educational research produces results or findings, but not science. Consequently, there are lots of arguments about what you should be doing reading, and almost everybody who is on one side or the other cites some research to support them, but it's the kind of research I was just talking about that has all of those problems. It's not the kind that is converging results from large, long-term studies that all reach the same conclusion. So what we wind up with here in the field of reading is, it seems like it's amazing how often people have research to quote that are on contradictory sides of the article. And so it has kind of become a joke in this field that reading studies, so to speak, are like Bible verses. You can find a Bible verse that will support nearly any philosophical point of view. So we have all these problems with reading and reading research, and one of the things that led to was a period of time that we're still in the tail end of it, known as the reading wars. And we'll talk later on, there are two large bodies of, let's call it points of view, about two primarily prevalent ways of teaching reading, and they're very different. So we wound up with the reading wars. So we wound up with the people who wanted to advocate learning how the intricate levels of language, like phonemes and syllables and that sort of thing, working on that is the best way to teach reading. And then there's a bunch of other folks who believe what I call the friction method of teaching reading. And that is where you take reading and the students and you rub them pleasantly together for about 2 or 3 years and read lots of stories and have a lot of fun with it. Next thing you know, they catch fire and they start to read. So any of you as parents who have more than one kid, I mean, if you're here tonight, you probably have one you're worried about. So, but you probably, if you have more than one kid, you probably have one that you're not worried about, and they were a kid for whom the friction method worked dandy. And we'll look at the data later on, but really, about 60% of kids are wired up so that if anybody makes a reasonable stab at teaching them to read, it'll work. And it doesn't even matter if it's a very good way to do it. They have enough, we say they are intuitive enough. That means they have enough native wiring to make the stuff they have to learn relatively easy. But then you've got the other 40% who are relatively non-intuitive, and if they don't get a certain kind of teaching, then that just doesn't work. So that's where we wound up, and the phonics people were on one end of this, and the whole language people were on the other end, and it was that war between them that actually led the federal government to fund the 35 years of studies I'm just going to talk to you about. Every 2 years when the federal government was faced with a budget, they had to decide where they were going to allocate the enormous amounts of money that they invest in education. And so during the reading wars, the phonics advocates called the other people the whole language nuts, and the whole language people called the phonics people the phonics nuts. And so one group of nuts or the other would go to Congress and tell the congressman that the other guys were crazy and they should give all the money to them. And so this happened repeatedly, and America's success in teaching children to read did not change. And some thoughtful people in Congress said, isn't there an answer to this? Can't we figure this out? and the National Science Center, the National Research Center, some of the federal government's research agencies, they said, well, yes, there is. So Congress started allocating money to find out scientific answers to the questions that divided the phonics advocates and the whole language advocates. So we had that big battle going on, and here we are. As we say, believe it or not, the solution to that battle was found here, your federal tax dollars at work. We don't often see such good results from our federal tax dollars, but this is a wonderful place where it really paid off. So starting back in about 1985 was when this research began, and it was actually, the money was allocated to the National Institute of Health, and they delegated it to the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And the Health and Human Development Agency got the money and did the research because it was their view, after seeing what happens to youngsters in America if they don't learn how to read, it was their view that it wasn't just a human development problem, it was actually a health problem based on how their lives turned out. And so there were serious enough consequences that that's where it went. So this money has now been funded steadily for a long period of time, for over 30 years. Now wait, contrast this to what I showed you earlier when I said what almost all of the typical reading research is, with 40 kids in the study, lasting for 8 months, with no replication studies. Look at what we've got going here. We have over 30 years of reading research, studying the reading development of over 100,000 students, divided among good readers and bad readers, so their job was to find out what happens when people really learn to read, but also what happens when they don't. And some were followed for more than their high school years, some were followed on through college. So the business about having too short of a study, that's not an issue here either. So where did this, who did this research and where was it located? So they selected 41 top research institutions in America with the top reading scholars, and you can see on the map where they were located and who the leading investigators were on those. They studied normal reading. They studied reading development of 100,000 children and adults. Looked at spent a lot of time looking at 30,000 good readers, over 30,000 kids with reading difficulties. Some studied for as long as 16 years. In the course of that, one of the questions they asked was, we have this quadrant of kids here, about 20 to 40% of kids who don't learn to read. Can we know ahead of time which kids those are going to be, or do we have to wait until they fail? And in the effort to answer that question, they wound up developing and validating screening tests, which are now quite a few of them out there. And so one of the most amazing gifts they have given educators is this gift now. We can screen children with a 5 or a 10-minute screen at the end of their 4th year, right when they're ready to enter kindergarten. 5 or 10 minutes, and with 95% accuracy, that screener will tell you, A, this is a kid that's going to get it no matter how anybody tries, as long as they do, or B, if you don't do it the right way, not going to work for this guy. What an incredible thing to know at kindergarten instead of waiting until they can't read in 4th grade. They also did prevention studies. What could be done when we screen these kids? If we know ahead of time, then what do our studies tell us we could be doing to actually prevent those kids from experiencing the reading failure? And then they looked at methodologies that could be used for intervention, and they tested them to see which methodologies were going to work. We'll talk about what they were later. Then they had, they took a variety of ways that schools are currently using to try to intervene when a kid is struggling with reading. And they studied those different ways of intervening, and they came out with clear advice to us about use these kinds of things, don't use those kinds of things. These work, those don't. Just showing the size and scope of the research. So what's the point of all this? And the answer is that we now have a huge body of widely replicated, scientifically valid research speaking with one voice on the key issues of reading instruction and preventing reading failure. It doesn't mean that there aren't still arguments going on about there. They're out there. There are a lot of people who haven't looked at the science, or they've looked at the science and they rather stick what they're doing, or for them, it isn't a question of science, it's a question of belief. They believe in this stuff, they don't believe in that stuff. So there's still a lot of arguments going on, and the majority of school districts in America are still using the stuff that this research tells us is not the right stuff, and they're still waiting until kids start to fail instead of identifying them early. So one of the things about Lawrence that is remarkable is that as an institution, it is a beacon to the community by, number one, offering free early reading screenings to parents from the community, and it models for all the other schools in this region that this is a practice that works. And because they use it with local parents, and local parents find out, A, the screening worked, B, it got my child into the right kind of instruction at the right time, it's a way to help schools. It's one of the functions of Lawrence is to be a kind of a beacon in the community that helps other schools learn about this. And it is also, when you look at Lawrence's practices, they follow the guidelines of reading science. And what happens is every year, kids are graduating from Lawrence who probably wouldn't have been graduating from any school had they not come and at Lawrence had the advantage of the kind of instruction that makes the difference here. Okay, so they also looked into what are the cognitive corollaries, what are the genetic components, what are the neurological conditions that foster strong reading, what are the developmental conditions that on the one hand can promote reading growth and development, what are those that inhibit reading acquisition, and they have come up with a list of risk factors that you can look at as a parent of a child from 1 to 5 years old, and you can look at those risk factors, and that can kind of give you early warning that your child may be one who will have difficulty with these things. So if you think about where we were before we had this data, this is an astonishing step forward. In the education world, this is the equivalent of the project to develop the atom bomb in World War II. That is looked at as one of the most spectacular successes of science in the world. And this is sort of the educational equivalent of it. It was so massive, and it is so important in terms of what it can do. Okay, so we know what works for struggling readers, and we now know what doesn't work. We know which screening tests and in-depth diagnostic tests to use. We know which teaching methods are the most effective for mediating deficits. And then, in the middle of their program doing this research, the government initiated the National Reading Panel and asked them to find all of the reading studies in the history of America that actually had a scientific design. Turned out there were about 115,000 of them. They put together an elite panel of scholars, and they said, you gather these things, you read them all, you compare the data, and see what commonality of findings there are among these 115,000 studies. And they did. And how nice. That meta-analysis of the studies came out saying that all the stuff that the NICHD studies were saying, that we needed to know about the child's level of phonemic awareness, we need to know about systematic phonics, oral reading, vocabulary comprehension. That is what the National Reading Panel findings concluded were the crucial things to improve reading instruction in America. Exactly the same things that NICHD was publishing. So that's sort of a double verification of the fact that this is true. So, okay, so here we go. Now we're going to go to step 2. Let's take a look at the steps that are involved in learning to read. What I'm going to share with you now is the sort of inside workings of how reading works in the brain and how the brain works in reading that have explained to us what is going on there, and these were the outcome of the NICHD studies. Okay, so at its most fundamental level, reading is an activity where you have symbols printed on a piece of paper, on a screen or something, and a person has to look at those symbols and convert them into oral language. So that's the process, going from the symbols on paper to spoken words. It requires a lengthy series of complex neurodevelopmental steps. So when I say neurodevelopmental steps, it means changes in the brain that have to take place to empower the child to read. These changes occur in the left hemisphere. You'll see a lot of pictures of the left hemisphere. You hear me referring to it all the time. The left hemisphere is actually the part of the brain that contains the fundamental language networks of the brain. It's where we learn to speak oral language, and it's where we learn how to understand oral language. And the reading parts take place in those same areas. Okay, so just mentioned the parts for spoken language. So there are places in the brain where very, very complex neural networks are built into the brain to support the acquisition of oral language. It would be nice if we had similar neurology to support the learning of reading, but we don't. Anybody take a guess why does the human brain have this elaborate set of networks that let kids learn language without any effort? All they have to do is be in a family where people talk. And after that, they're talking, right? Why is it that we got that in oral language and we don't have it for reading? Anybody got a guess? Well, oral reading language, you're right, you're on the track. Oral language is innate in that we came equipped with the neural networks to do it. But my question is, how come we don't have the similar networks for reading? Anybody got a guess? Don't be too shy. What do you think? Anybody know how long human beings have been reading? So, written alphabetic languages that were designed to capture spoken language have only been around for 5,000 years. So that's back to about 3000 BC. And for the first 3,000 years, they had writing and had reading of that writing, but only a tiny fraction of the human beings on the earth were exposed to it and learned how to do it. And in fact, reading wasn't really widespread in the world until the invention of the printing press in the 1400s, 1500s. But on talking, on the other hand, human beings and their most recent ancestors have been talking, that the anthropologists think, for about 1 million years. And so that's a long time. So why, it still bugs the question, why develop all this elaborate neurology to support talking and understanding written language? It's because it's a survival benefit. Our ancestors, the ones who could communicate orally the best, could organize themselves the best, they had a better chance of finding 10 guys who could work together to kill a mammoth without having to use hand signals. So it had great survival value. And so from an evolutionary point of view, what happened over a period of 1 million years, an enormously powerful network was developed in the brain. Here's one for you. The brain's networks for developing oral language is so powerful that there are cases on record of little children who were born to parents who did not speak. They were deaf, they didn't talk, and they didn't read. And they had children who, because of their isolation from the rest of the community, weren't exposed to other people. And guess what those children did? They developed their own language. And astonishingly, the language was guided by the very same principles that the language we all learned from our parents was. That means those things were hardwired in. Isn't that amazing? Kids actually created language when the parents weren't talking. So here's the part of the brain, this left hemisphere, and this is where the oral language what happened here? Well, I got the pointer, but not, so there we go. Yes. All right, so this is the part where we learn to move our lips and our tongue and our teeth to create the sounds. This is the part where we send that information over here, and this is the part where we learn to auditorily identify sounds and link them up to letters, and this is the visual portion of the brain back here, and this is the part that learns to just recognize words when we're reading. In spoken language, though, it does the different job. Here, gotta stop doing that, sorry. Here, you learn how to make the sounds. Here you learn how to interpret and understand the sounds and recognize them. And here you can use visual input to support that. Here's another look at those features. And so this shows up some special. This is the motor cortex, is where you plan how you're going to shape the letters when you're trying to do handwriting. This is where you plan how you're going to move your lips and tongue and teeth and so forth to create the words you're saying. This is where we represent the sounds of the language with signs, with symbols. This is the visual area where we recognize those, and this is where we can recognize a whole series of letters here. And you notice that these things all connect to reading, but they're all in the same place where the speaking is. So, to say it another way about what is the process of reading all about, it is about rewiring the brain. It's going to the part of the brain where we already have elaborate networks for talking and understanding spoken language, and getting involved there and building new networks out of some of those neurons that already have another job, building new associations and building them to perform different kinds of activity, such as reading, in the same area that is performing activity that has to do with creating oral language or listening to it. So this is a very hard job. Getting neurons to make new connections requires lots and lots of stimulation. It requires the person whose brain is trying to do this to be determined to make it work. The person has to want to do it. They have to be very invested to make it happen. Not easy, and it can take quite a while. And there are things you can do to speed it up and things you can do that sound like they might be logical to impede it, although you might not know that that would be the result. Okay, and so now we come to this business about inherited developmental differences in brains. Because there are differences in the way people's brains are organized at birth, this rewiring can be, relatively speaking, easier or harder. I mentioned earlier the concept of being intuitive. Where you're intuitive, your brain has been organized in such a way that to do the things learn the things that you're kind of intuitive at, it comes, relatively speaking, more easily. Where you're non-intuitive, it becomes very, very hard. Okay, so how is that proportioned out? About 40% of all kids in this country have extreme difficulty learning to read. Some learn to read moderately or reasonably well, but not great, with some difficulty. And then some learn with hardly any difficulty at all, become dazzling readers right off the bat. So there are primarily two sources of the problems that cause 40% of America's children not to learn to read. The first is, it is a circumstance about half of the non-readers. It's caused by the inherited condition often referred to as dyslexia. It is a condition that involves significant differences in the way the brain processes or is structured. I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute that will show you what I'm talking about there. 85% of dyslexic children have an immediately blood-related relative, mother, father, blood-related aunt, uncle, or grandparent, who has a very significant reading or spelling problem. Reading, writing, and spelling problem. So children who have an immediate blood relative who's got one of those serious issues, their likelihood of having that same wiring goes way up. The other half of the children who regularly do not learn to read, the issue there is an entirely different problem. Children who grow up in extreme poverty often experience a very reduced level of oral language and communication in their homes. Risley and Hart did a groundbreaking study. They got permission to put tape recorders into the homes of professional families, affluent families who were college educated. Then they were able to put the tape recorders into working class families, and then they went to inner city, mostly inner city, extreme poverty situations, and they recorded for a full year every incidence of spoken language inside that home. From that data, they were able to calculate how many words the children in each of those different types of homes was encountering. The children in the most disadvantaged homes were getting about 16 million words. The children in the working class homes were getting 26 million words. The children in the affluent homes of professional parents were getting 46 million words. So what you really have there then, in the gap between the lowest performing kids and the highest performing kids, is a difference of 30 million words. Now, each word that is spoken is processed in the oral language processing parts of the brain. Each counts as a stimulus to the neural networks are there. And every time the neural network has to process a new word, it gets a little stronger and a little better at doing that. So the difference between kids who are getting 16 million chances to strengthen that processing part of the brain and the kids who are getting 46 million chances is astounding. So the kids from that lowest category show up in school, generally, this is an average, with the average oral language development of a 3-year-old. They are 2 years or more behind in just the development of their oral and spoken language before they get to kindergarten. That means that the cortex in that area has not developed to the place where the kid who was getting the 26 million or the 46 million words, and those kids have neurology that is much more able to be adapted to reading. So that's a huge problem. There's a difference here between this problem and the problem of the children who have the kind of wiring that we call dyslexic. For the children who are dyslexic, thanks to the NICH studies, we know what to do. And we know how to do it. And schools like Lawrence are experts at doing it. For the children with the low language development, well, we still know what to do. We need to get them exposed to very rich and dense language so that they start to catch up on the number of opportunities that part of the brain has had to develop strength in managing that. The part we don't know now is how to deliver that kind of stuff at an intensity level that provides enough of the extra stimulation to help those kids catch up and erase a part of that deficit. So for the dyslexic children, there are both physiological differences. The way their brains are built is different. And there are also differences in the way they process the language in the brain. The NICHD study showed us that there were 4 what they taught us to call neurological correlates of dyslexia. So each of these is a thing we can screen for, and we can know. I see what you're doing, I just can't read it from here. Thanks. She's telling me how much time I have, okay? I always have a hard time making all this fit into the amount of time I have. So I have a helper back there who's going to try to keep me from going over and having you guys stay. And by the way, when we get to the end, I just want to say this. Anybody who's got a time limit that I'm not in coordination with in terms of when I'm finishing up, if you got a baby, whatever it is, babysitter, Robin, I'm perfectly okay if your timing means that you've got to go. And in your notes, you have a copy of my phone number and a copy of my email address. And so if any of you feels like you missed some stuff and you want to be in touch with me and talk about it or ask a question, you just call me up or email me and we'll talk about that, okay? All righty, so here are the 4 neurological correlates. Phonemic awareness, going to talk in detail about what that is in a few minutes. Phonological processing, I'll explain each of these things. Rapid automatic retrieval of information that's stored in the brain that has to do with oral language. And automatic recognition of words. So these are all things that we can screen for, and we can know this kid is fine in those areas, or this kid has some serious deficits here. Any one of those things, if a kid has a major deficit in that area, it's enough to block the reading process. For a long time, there was a lot of argument about dyslexia because kids with dyslexia present with a variety of the problems that dyslexia can present. Some kids are terrible readers, but terrible oral readers, but not so bad as silent readers. Some kids have a lot of problem with phonemic awareness, but they're very good with phonological memory or with rapid retrieval. Or they can be bad at all four, have a combination of three. So those variations about how these kids present for a long time made it look like the term dyslexia wasn't a good one because it seemed to cover too many different varieties of what was going on. Actually, however, modern research has shown us that it's merely an expression of how many of those four neurological correlates are in play and how serious the deficits are there. So that's why there's such a wide range. The big change about no longer arguing about whether there is such a thing about dyslexia or not came when a group of scientists were working with the International Dyslexia Association. They raised some money, and they wanted to look at brains of dyslexic people and find out if they were actually different than the brains of people who learned to read easily. So they found a lot of people of very high attainment in life. People who have been high-performing and high-achieving people who were clearly dyslexic, and they went to them and said, we want to ask you a little favor here. We want to know if we can have your brain when you're done with it. And some of them said, well, yes, you can. So they took these brains to Beth Israel Hospital in Boston, and they worked with MIT to develop computer programs that could look at slides of, that were taken through the brains of these people after they had died. And for the very first time, what this research proved was we could literally see physical differences that appeared in the brains of all of these accomplished dyslexic adults, but they were not found in non-dyslexic brains. So we began to see for the first time, these are big differences. So that was the first time we had absolute ironclad proof that dyslexic brains are different. So these are looking down at the top at the two hemispheres. Left hemisphere and right hemisphere have a place there called the planum temporale. On the left hemisphere, the planum temporale does a lot of stuff in language, both the spoken and written language, and a lot of stuff goes on there in reading. In most of the population, the planum temporale is much more robustly developed on the left because that's the language side of the brain. And you can see it's just smaller on the right. In dyslexic, it's the opposite. In dyslexics, the left is less robustly developed, and the more robustly developed in the planum temporale is the right. Here's another feature they found in the planum temporale. There were fewer neurons in the planum temporale of the dyslexics, and they were much more widely dispersed. So you can see on the left, you can see how dense those neurons are, all the little black dots. And on the right, this is a planum temporale of a dyslexic child. And you can see they're working with less machinery there for both oral and spoken language and for reading. Second thing they found that was very interesting is your brain has a built-in cushion. So you have the cortex where most of the neural activity goes on when you're thinking or remembering or doing all the normal conscious stuff. But those things can be harmed by bad bumps on the head. So there's a little place where there's a membrane over the cortex, and above that there's sort of a space and then another membrane. And in the space, there's liquid that acts as a cushion. So when you get a good knock on the head, a lot of that force is absorbed by that liquid and not communicated down to the neurons so that it damages them. So there's a rule in the brain. No neurons could go up above that lower level membrane. You see that dividing line right there? So neurons are not allowed to be up there. In dyslexic kids and adults, there were places where there appeared to be a hole in that membrane, and neurons went up in there anyway. And once they got up in there, they did an odd thing. Neurons usually disperse out pretty nicely, so it's easy to form all their networks, connect to one another. When they got up in one of these places, they built what the researchers called a tangled mass, which really interfered with those neurons' ability to talk to one another sensibly. So these things have a name. They are called ectopias, from a Greek word meaning outside the top, right? So you can see them sticking out there. Here's another one that's a little more visible. And not only did dyslexics have these ectopias, where they were made a difference. Remember, this is the language processing part of the brain. This is where we learn to talk. This is where we learn to read. Here's where the ectopias were. What do you see? It's right in the middle of that factory, isn't it? If you were going to cause trouble, that's where you would put it. And so that was a physiological example of something different in the brain that might account for the problems with reading. Okay, so then I said there were two kinds of differences that they found. Some were structural, we just looked at those. Some were processing differences. So a normal reader uses this area when they're reading. What else is in this area? Don't make me think you haven't been paying attention. That's your oral language. That's where you learn to speak and learn to understand. And then what else do we do over there? That's where we learn to read. What does it look like in the brain of a dyslexic child when they're learning to read in the left hemisphere? But we couldn't know this until they developed functional magnetic resonance imaging. So using this stuff, you can tell where the lights are in the brain, where the lights are on when somebody's trying to do something. So you give them a task, and you do an FMRI, and you can see which part of the brain they're using. So here is a normal reader. They're using the left hemisphere. Yay, that's what they're supposed to be doing. Here is a dyslexic reader. What's going on in the left hemisphere? Most of the lights are out. They're not using that turf. Now remember, that is the turf that's built for language, right? There's not a bunch of that language stuff over on the other hemisphere. So here is a normal reader. You can see left hemisphere activity up here all over the place. What do you see going on in the right hemisphere? Next to nothing going on there. Here's a dyslexic reader. Let's take a look at the left hemisphere. What's happening over here? Nothing, lights are out. Where's the activity? In the right hemisphere. So dyslexic kids are trying to use neural turf that has nothing to do with language to compensate for some of the differences that they have inherited in their left hemisphere. So in other words, that part's not so functional, so they go over to the other side and try to make it work over there. It doesn't work very well because that part of the brain is not built for the kinds of tasks that you need to do to learn to read, of taking a whole separate series of little individual sounds, identifying, seeing the letter, identifying the sound, letter, sound, and then adding them together. That's the kind of stuff the left hemisphere is better at, that linear, sequential, analytical, and then assembled kind of thing. Right hemisphere likes to see a bunch of stuff and right off the bat just see a pattern. Right hemisphere does not like to break it down into a bunch of little pieces and try to assemble them. So they are actually trying to use turf that isn't wired up to be very good for that. So now we're talking about kids with neurologically based issues that make learning to read hard for them. And what we want to say now is that we see whether your brain is wired up this way or that way, whether you're an intuitive language learner or non-intuitive language learner, everybody has to go through the same developmental steps in their brain. If you're trying to do it over here, it's harder, it takes longer, it doesn't work as well. But if you're trying to do it over here, it's eventually going to work better. And this is where good readers all do their work. Some kids can master each of those 5 steps with only a little bit of input from a teacher. They are so intuitive about that that they do a lot of self-teaching. Struggling readers, I want to say that they look like, when you just observe one of these intuitive kids learning to read, you could easily conclude that kids don't need much teaching to learn to read. So remember that method I mentioned earlier? Call it the friction method, right? It's an easy way to do it, and if you're working with kids who are intuitive, rub them together with reading for a little while, catch fire, off they go, they're readers. Okay, so that confused the whole issue about good readers and bad readers and what kind of teaching worked and doesn't. Because if you're working mainly with kids who are pretty intuitive about it, often those are kids, unless they're dyslexic. Should mention this. So we're talking in the Risley study, we're talking about well-off, well-educated parents, working-class parents, and kids in extreme poverty, right? Dyslexia shows no favorites in terms of socioeconomic status. The 20% of children who wind up being dyslexic are evenly distributed across the human race. There is no preference for or against wealthy or poor or working class. So that's often it's a miscalculation that the children of the well-educated professional parents would never have dyslexia. Well, that's not the cause of dyslexia. It's genetics. They inherited it likely from some member of their family. There are some injuries that can occur to the brain that will cause the same kind of outcome as dyslexia, and so we're lumping them together here. It's like dyslexia that doesn't come from inheritance, it comes from a bunk on the head somehow. Okay, so these are the steps that all readers go through, even some readers, that most intuitive ones, don't look like they do. And that's a problem when they don't, because it misleads teachers. If they watch a whole bunch of their kids who need almost no teaching to make this whole reading thing happen, what might they conclude? Kids don't need that, because I've got a whole bunch of great readers in my classroom, and I didn't teach all that stuff. They know how to do this stuff, and I didn't teach it. See, kids learn that by themselves. No, only if they have the great wiring. And the kids we're here to talk about tonight are the kids who aren't learning to read very well, who are at risk for being among the 20% who will fail. They are not the kids who will learn on our own. And the fact is, if they don't get the kind of teaching that supports the way they learn, they won't get it at all. But this has misled many in the field to think that everybody should be able to learn to read from the friction method. All right, we're going to take a look at these steps, going to talk about them a little bit, and you'll see how they correspond to those 4 neurological correlates I was talking about earlier, those brain differences that we can test for and screen. You'll see how these correspond to that. You can see why if you're low on gas in the phonemic awareness tank, you'll be able to see why that would be a barrier to reading. So let's take a look at those things. So at each step here, it is up to the reader or the teacher to make sure they get that down pat, because if you fail at one step, every succeeding step will be impaired. It's not like you couldn't do anything on those succeeding, but your outcome on those other ones will be impaired. All right, so first we're going to this thing called phonological, where phono means sound, the suffix on it means system or logic for figuring it out. So it's a system of how the sounds work in our language. And it's a general kind of term, and it means becoming aware of the fact as a toddler, as a baby, becoming aware of the fact that sounds clump together in different ways, and that the oral language that they're learning by listening to mom and dad is made up of these clumps of sounds. And the older they get, as long as their wiring is okay, they're able then to look at smaller and smaller and smaller clumps of those sounds and to recognize them and to use them to learn to read. So that's a very important piece. Now we're going to talk about a step up from that. And that is the step called phonemic awareness. That's becoming aware of the fact that every word is made up of several individual little sounds that are distinctly different from one to another. And that when you put those sounds together and blend them together, they turn into a word. Some children are born with a very high capacity to learn how to identify the individual sounds in a word. Others have very low capacity. So when they process a word, suppose the teacher says the word blister, gets everybody to say it back, and then says, what's the third sound in that word? There are going to be some children in that class who can segment each sound and think to themselves, and as well, it's either the it or the s. Okay, let's call it s. They can sort of count over and get the sound. Other kids will say to the teacher, I don't know what you're talking about. It's all one sound. Blister. It's blister. It's not like this sound, that sound, the other sound. So if a kid is stuck at that point, if you know anything about teaching reading, you know the point where you're supposed to learn how to get individual sounds and link them to individual written letters. If you can't do the individual sounds, you are in a lot of trouble learning to read. Okay, so phonemic awareness is critical for that step where you begin to link individual sounds with the letters. You have to be able to distinguish that they're individual sounds. You have to be able, within a word, you have to be able to segment the sounds. If I say, what are the four sounds you hear in flat? To be good with phonemic, you got to be able to get the first sound is f, the second is oh, the third is ah, the fourth is t. You got to be able to identify them. You got to be able to take them apart and say, well, what would that word be if you left out the ul? And then you have to then be able to recall that f, take out the ul. Got the ah, just put it together. Now you have fat. So that's phonemic manipulation. So those are the kinds of skills you test when you do the screener to see if kids can do this kind of stuff. So there is a sort of a physical problem here, and it is that, okay, I'm going to say, while I'm saying the sentence, I'm going to ask you to do something. Count all the spaces you hear between the words while I'm saying the sentence. How many times in this sentence or multiple sentences strung together have you heard a pause that separated a bunch of sounds from one another? How many were in there? 0, right? Because when we speak, the sounds flow out like water. Water doesn't flow out like a little piece and a little piece and a little piece. It flows all together. And so do the sounds in oral language. So if you are low in phonemic awareness and you can't distinguish that, and you hear sounds flowing out as if it's water, you've got a big problem. So we call it, it's called the asymmetry. It is not symmetrical. When we talk, the sounds are all stuck together with no sounds, no spaces. When we read, each sound can be segmented from the other because each is represented by a different symbol on the page. And for words, there's even a space between the words, right? So we clump those. So that is a challenging thing for kids. So I'm going to do a little simulation with you here and give you a chance to feel what this is like. So I'm going to recite a little children's poem. My sister did this to me when I was a little kid and embarrassed me because I couldn't figure out what this was all about. And so I'm going to share it with you. It is a poem. Some of you may know it ahead of time. If you hear what I'm saying and you already know this poem, don't play the game with us, okay? Everybody else, here's how I want you to play the game. I'm going to recite this simple little poem. I promise you, honest to goodness, it's real English words that you know, okay? So then I'm going to ask you, after I recite the poem, to tell me what the real English words were and what the poem meant. You ready? Yes. Here we go. Maresy-dos and dozy-dos, little lambsy-divey, kiddly-divey too, wouldn't you? Okay, raise your hand if you know that poem. All right, don't play. All right, those who did not raise your hand, what's the words in the first line? Need me to say it again? Maresy-dos and dozy-dos, little lambsy-divey. What words are you hearing? Do you think I'm fibbing, that they're not really words? What'd you say? I'm half deaf, so you got to speak up. You have an idea? Oh, I know it. Okay, you can't play that. Again, give it to you again. Maresy-dos and dozy-dos, little lambsy-divey, kiddly-divey too, wouldn't you? I promise you, they're honest to goodness, real English words. All right, how about if I tell you the first word is mares? You know what a mare is? Horse, right? A female horse, okay. Maresy-dos and dozy-dos, anybody get it now? Maresy-dos, what's that saying? Loud. Eats oats? Yeah, who eats oats? The mare. Mares eat oats. And dozy-dos? Those eat those. Little lambsy-divey? Little lambsy-divey? Little lambs eat ivy. Well, how come you couldn't do it before and now you can? Why didn't that work? Because I set it up so that you had the equivalent of low phonemic awareness. You could not separate where the sounds were, so they didn't sound like real words. You never heard a word like maresy-dotes before, right? You couldn't do it. That is exactly the situation a child is in kindergarten, first and second grade, when the teacher wants them to segment the sounds in the word, and they cannot do it because they have low phonemic awareness. Now, I was doing it with you with larger chunks of sound, right? So there's an example of how low phonemic awareness can stop people cold. Because I gave you the stimulus a whole bunch of times until I at least told you where the first division was by giving you the word mayors. At that point, well, she was telling me I needed to hurry it up. Okay, here we go. Okay, so that's phonemic awareness. Let's move ahead. Got to move back first. All right, here we go. Okay, now we're going to look at a thing called phonological, that's the whole sound system again, processing, and this is based on the child's ability to employ phonemic awareness to work with individual sounds. Phonological processing moves up the ladder a little bit, and now you're going to be working with manipulating and recognizing clumps of sound. So, like in the word sunset, you can manipulate that by you could hear one clump, sun, another clump, set, and then you can do that, a similar thing with more complicated words. So phonological processing is, phonemic awareness is identifying them, phonological processing move up, and what you're doing is learning how to segment and put together larger clumps of sounds to make words or to make syllables. Again, you can see, if you don't have phonological processing, and you're trying to learn how to sound out words with syllables, you can see how you could be stuck if you don't have that. So that's the next step up. And when you get the phonological processing stuff going, then you move on to decoding and encoding. And this is where you take a word and you decode it. You look at all the symbols in the code, and then you decode it into oral language. And encoding is where you take the sounds. Somebody says, spell house, and you have to take those sounds and then turn them into the code, okay? And so that's the next step in the process. When we move up from decoding and encoding, when you get good at that, the next chore is what is called automatic word recognition or orthographic. Again, you got some Latin base words there. It means from the written shape of the word, the orthography of the word, the shape of it as it's written. So decoding and encoding is one of the early stages of reading. As kids can look at a word they don't know and get all the sounds and decode it, they can say it out loud, and then they say, oh, I know that word, even though I didn't recognize it on paper. Okay. So that's a crucial piece of the process here. And if you are fast at decoding and encoding, then your reading sounds like reading. If you're slow at decoding and encoding, see if anybody would have a child like this. They do little parts of the word and little parts of the word and little parts of the word, and it's very slow and lots of spaces. Anybody heard a kid read like that or tried to read? Yeah, okay. So that kid is still struggling with the decoding and the encoding. That's critical because you have to get up to the level where you actually see a word and you know what it is. How many of you are pretty good readers or really good readers? Okay. So think about this. When do you decode a word? When you're reading, you don't decode many words, do you? You're not decoding every word because you already know those words, right? You see them, you know them. Don't have to decode them anymore. So this is the place where reading goes from breaking the code and using the code to automatically knowing the word. And that's crucial. If you don't get this down, you cannot become a fluent reader. And we're going to take a look at that next. And then where we're really trying to go is to be great at comprehension. If you struggle with encoding and decoding, if you lack automatic word recognition, if you aren't a fluent oral reader, you become a lousy comprehender. So you can see how each of these steps builds on the previous one to get you to the place, the goal, where we really want to be, is up there. So orthographic word recognition, the process starts with phonemic awareness. You start working in this area where you're analyzing and articulating the word. When you move ahead in phonological processing, you get where you start processing the word in chunks, and then you get to where you can finally recognize the word altogether. So we've made the processing go from the frontal temporal area to the middle to the back, and this is where your eyes and all the things associated with vision. Sometimes people think dyslexia is a problem with vision. It is only a problem with vision when it comes time to move all of the preliminary work over to the occipital part of the brain where the visual part is. Because what you really want, you want to have to not decode words unless they're brand new to you. You want to know them automatically. Okay, so that is a slow process that readers go through, moving that processing to the rear of the brain, the visual part. How do you get words there? So the people who use a system of reading that is primarily a friction system, they encourage children to recognize whole words rather than sound them out. And when children act like they recognize whole words, they believe that the kids skipped the sounding out process. But guess what? They didn't skip it, they just got good at it quite fast without a lot of help from the adults. So it can look like they didn't have to do that, but they do. To get, for average readers and poor readers, to get whole words into that part of the brain where you recognize them automatically, you have to decode them effectively dozens of times. And built on that structure, your brain starts to recognize this word's pieces and eventually moves sort of a photograph of it back to the back. Now you have that word for automatic word recognition. So I always say this because the people who do whole language or LLI or other kinds of friction method teachings, they think readers can start out by just seeing a word and getting it back here so you recognize it automatically. What I'm telling you now is you only get a word deposited in that bank if you have decoded it many, many, many times and built the structure for it to go back there. Fluent and accurate oral reading. So fluency is a critical issue. It is defined as the capacity to employ a subskill rapidly and accurately without conscious thought when you're performing a higher level skill. And so the way I explain fluency is I have a grandson. He was learning how to play the piano. And I don't know how many of you had piano lessons when you were a kid or have kids that are getting piano lessons, but there seems to be a law somewhere that whenever a kid is learning piano, they have to learn this little piece by Beethoven called Für Elise. And my grandson wanted me to listen to him play Für Elise. He had practiced it a lot, and he learned every single note and chord in Für Elise. No mistakes. But he had to hold his hands kind of up like this and think about, after he did each little note or chord correctly, he had to think a little bit about what the next one was. He played all of Für Elise, but it wasn't music. It was a collection of related sounds hovering near one another over a period of time. I had to listen to that, to Für Elise, performed in that fashion until I came to conclude that it's one of the most dreadful pieces of music that's ever been written. And I don't know why every music teacher makes every darn kid learn it. So anyway, the issue was Dylan wasn't fluent. Did he know it? Yes, he made mistakes. Was he fluent? No. So guess what? Wasn't music. Kids can decode words or identify words, but if they're not fluent, it sounds like this. And the problem with reading that way is your brain has a set amount of processing capacity. We often refer to it as limited X. If X stands for processing, you got a limited amount in your brain. If all of it is going into the decoding and you aren't fluent, you have none of that X left over to think about what in the heck did those words mean when they went all together. So you can say the words in a sentence form but not have a clue of what means. So if that's the case, then we're at a place where, I'll do this a second. If that's the case, we're at a place where you're not fluent, and because you're not fluent, you have no access to the meaning. Everything was used there. What would make a kid be not fluent? So the third element in those 4 neurological correlates is called rapid naming, rapid recognition, or rapid retrieval of information. So it turns out that people can store stuff in their brain, and it's absolutely there. There's no question. We can test. They definitely know what it is. But kids get that stuff back out when they need to call it at a different rate. So they use this, the RAN, the Rapid Automatic Naming Test, to do this. So we ask the child, what color is that? Yellow. What's that one? Blue. They say the name of every color on it. It's only 5 colors. We say, okay, we're going to play a little game here. What I would like you to do is I'd like you to start right here and then just say the names of all those colors as fast as you can, and I'm going to time it and see how you can do on the timing. So if you do that with any classroom of kids, whether it's a kindergarten kids or 8th or 9th grade kids, what you're going to get is a kind of a bell curve of how fast these kids do it. Some kids are like lightning. You get them all right. So we already know every kid knows every sound because we asked them ahead of time. What's the sound? They told us, right? So what's their problem here? Not that they don't know the sound. It is that what? They can't retrieve it quickly. It's in there. They just can't extract it very quickly. Well, what if a kid has learned what every letter, written letter in the English sound, what sound it makes, and has it all perfectly stored in the brain, but they can't retrieve it quickly? Then even when they sound a word out, what does it sound like? B, a, n, n, Okay, banana, right? But because they can't retrieve the sounds quickly, it sounds like they don't know the sounds. That's another problem we run in with teaching reading. When we're not doing it according to the science of reading, people hear something like that and think this person hasn't learned the sounds, and they go back teaching decoding again. Well, the kid has it, just like the kid who knows the color of that. So we do this test. We do it with these 5 little images, and then we do it with numerals, and we do it with letters. It provides a rapid automatic naming or a RAN score, and what it tells you is whether this kid has a problem with rapid retrieval. So every step we've covered so far in the learning to read process could be going fine, and you could hit the spot where now you need rapid retrieval and they don't have that. Guess what? They sound like they don't know the stuff earlier in the sequence. So it's very important to us. And then the big deal is, from a parent and a teacher point of view, it turns out that you can have a deficit on the phonology side, the phonemic awareness and phonological processing side, or decoding side. You can have a deficit in the rapid recall side. Or, worse luck, you can have a deficit in both sides. So here's why that's really important to know. Because the kids who have a double deficit, both a rapid retrieval deficit and a phonological deficit, are far and away the hardest kids to remediate. So parents should know that ahead of time because they know the hill is going to be steeper and it's going to take long. But teachers should know it too, because they have to make compensation for that and build their plans around what it's going to take for that remediation to be effective. All right, so then if you get all of that stuff in line, now you're ready to qualify for high-level comprehension of complex text. And of course, that's what the whole game is about, right? Can you really understand what you're reading? So to get up there, any one of these steps, if it's broken or isn't addressed properly, it impedes your ability to perform at the high level. So there we have the steps in learning to read. Okay, now we're going to talk about sources of reading problems. We talked a little bit about it already. We'll jump ahead through some of that. So about 60% of all kids learn to read well enough to be passable. But about 40% don't. About 20, kind of in the middle, 20 down at the bottom. In the US, 50 million school kids, that means 30 million are learning, by the way, we're mostly teaching in schools fairly well. About 10 million, it's a real struggle, and they sort of get to reading, but it's not very good reading. The big problem for those kids is, even though they can read somewhat, they don't read well enough for reading to be a tool for learning in middle and high school. They read well enough to parse out a little bitty story in 4th grade, but by the time you get to 4th grade, you're supposed to be reading to learn, not learning to read. So that's critical. And then we've got about 10 million kids down on the bottom who just absolutely fail to read. That's scary graphics. And then here's what it looks like in the Cleveland area. If you look at those same percentages, say we're talking about a lot of children. So that raises the question of how important it is that the people dealing with those 200,000 children understand the science of reading in the way that NICHD has shared with us, so they can identify them early and do the kinds of things early that will fix the problem and get them up and running at an early time. So what are the risk factors? So we have the genetic factor, I mentioned that. A second risk factor is if kids have delayed acquisition of oral language. There are milestones that the speech-language people will tell you about when a kid is supposed to be able to do this with oral language and this and this. If they're a year or so behind, that represents a problem in the oral language, the talking part of the brain, that's going to also then affect the reading part when you try to do that. Or if they have chronic ear infections and they get a lot of fluid built up in the ear, and then that means that the sounds that are going in that the brain is supposed to be learning about, because it's all muddy, the sounds are going through, essentially going through mud, the differences in those sounds are blended, and these children don't learn to distinguish. For instance, they literally cannot hear and tell you the difference between short I, and short E, eh. Same sound to them. So chronic ear infection, or a child with a hearing impairment early on. Or we have the issues with oral language development associated with that 30 million word gap. So that's the general sources, okay? Here are the 4 primary neurological correlates of dyslexia, of the physiological differences in neurology. Those are the #1 cause of reading deficits. Second big cause is we don't train our teachers properly. Some years back, I had a chance to work with the Ohio Board of Regents, and we reviewed the curriculum that teachers had to complete to get a teacher's certificate for elementary teacher, for reading specialist, or reading interventionist. We have 58 colleges of education in the state. How many of those colleges in the curriculum, the way they laid out their curriculum, they shared knowledge about the science of reading with their young teacher preparation candidates? Anybody got a guess? Think of the worst thing, what's the worst possible answer that could be the answer to the question? That's the answer. Not one college of education in the state had this stuff embedded in their curriculum. It's changing now because once the Board of Regents saw that, they put together a panel that I was a part of that actually got the chance to write the specific additions that need to go into the curriculum to add it in so teachers start to get it, but the colleges can't implement it like that. They're having a hard time finding enough trainers to get it done, but at least we're on the trail of making sure that now we're going to train our teachers to know this stuff. So here's another problem with learning English. English is probably the hardest alphabetic language in the world to learn, and that's because the people, the original or early inhabitants of England, before, in the period starting from about 1000 BC on, they had a habit of getting conquered by people who spoke different languages. And every 400 or 500 years, a bunch of new people came in and took over. So early on, it was the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes who lived over on the continent in Germany and what we think of as Germany and France, and they spoke Germanic language. And the people who already were in England spoke a Celtic language. And so they came over and imposed their Anglo-Saxon spellings and pronunciations on the language. And to make any progress in that country, once it was ruled by the Anglo-Saxons, you had to learn their language, so a lot of that stuff became a part of England. And then about 400 or 500 years after that settled down, the Vikings came along and invaded and took over and ruled England for a while. Well, guess what? They spoke a Nordic language, and so we added in a bunch of different kinds of spellings and different words. And when they got assimilated and the language got put together with all these new additions to it, then along came the Norman French. They spoke French. And in 1066, the Battle of Hastings, they conquered England, they became the rulers of England, and for the next 500 years, we're incorporating a whole bunch of this French stuff, spellings into our language. So here's the net result of all of this stuff. Well, the other thing that happened, in the 1600s, we had the Renaissance, and we rediscovered the Romans and the Greeks, and we found out that they were dazzling cultures, even though we'd forgotten about them for 1,000 years. So everybody went back and studied Roman and Greek, and we thought they were so far more advanced than we were, we should incorporate a lot of their stuff in our language. We put a lot of stuff in. So what sound does CH make usually? What's another one that it makes? Yes. So when you hear CH, that's a Latin, see it saying K, that's a Latin one. So here's another sound that says Q-U-E, antique. That's Greek. So here's the net result of all of this stuff. We spell one single vowel, the vowel E, 8 different ways. Just holler them out. Yell out a word that has an E and tell us how that one is spelled. I'll start. The word is me. The sound E is spelled with a single E. Somebody else, give me a word, give me how it's spelled. Meal. How? 2 E's. Okay, another one. Read. Gotta be loud, I can't hear you. E-A. All right, there you go. How about chief? How about baby? Y. How about monkey? Y. Okay. So that's how we spell our language. And all of those are ways of spelling that we got from a different language, and we wadded them all together to the misery of school children. So Spanish has 28 sounds, and they spell them 36 different ways. Try that. That's the proper response. We have 44 sounds. Some people argue we had 46. We spell them a total of 1,133 different ways. And that means we have to read them 1,133 ways to be able to read those words too. So that's why, another reason why English is a hard language to learn. Okay, here we are, hitting the home stretch here. What are the keys to preventing reading failure? First, if you can know before the kid sets foot in kindergarten that his wiring means that he is trying to use the right hemisphere to do this work instead of the left hemisphere, you know what has to be done then to do the teaching to compensate for that and to get that child to build new networks in the left hemisphere that he can use to get that work done. So the first is early identification. The second one is, as soon as you know there's an issue or that kid is at risk, start the right kind of teaching right there. In America right now, the average kid doesn't really get solidly identified as having a serious reading problem until 3rd grade. That means we just lost several years of time we could have been working. And while we're losing that time and not fixing the problem, how is that child feeling in school? Did you say horrible? If you said horrible, you're right.
If we can identify earlier, why aren't they intervening earlier?
They're unconvinced as of yet.
When my son was 3 in preschool, I went to the teachers and the school psychologist, and I'm like, I think he's dyslexic. Oh no, you wouldn't be able to know that until 3rd grade. And I mean, they kept telling me that, and I could say, no.
So you can know, you or other parents or other concerned, send your child to Lawrence's free early reading screening. And then you know.
What screening tool is that?
There's a variety of them now because among the people who are doing work in this field, more and more people are trying to build better screeners and screeners that are simpler to use. I have a list in here. You'll see it in your notes when we get there in a bit. Okay. So the third thing is, once you identify them, and once you start intervening right away, what if you use the friction method with them? You're right where you were, right? So the first 2 steps are wasted. To make the first 2 steps work, you got to use the kind of instruction that NICHD proved to us actually remediates the deficit. So those are the 3 keys. So one thing schools can do is do the risks that we know are present. Do an assessment of the risks. And what schools really ought to do when they enroll kids in kindergarten, they ought to take a quick bio from the parents and find out if any of those 4 factors are present. Because if they are, they certainly raise the likelihood this kid's going to have trouble. So here's the name of some of the screeners you could use. One is called the Task. It's one of the more recent ones. I think it's shorter. It's only about 5 minutes for the quickest one, and it's more sophisticated in some ways. The PAR is a predictive assessment of reading that Lawrence introduced to Ohio, and they use that. It's a computer-based one, which guarantees that it's not dependent upon whether the person who's administering the test really knows what they're doing or not, because it is a computer-monitored and created one. So that's a really good. And the top one now is the C-top. It always has been. It's much more in-depth, and it gives you more evidence about each place where there's a problem. It investigates it more. And it gives you the most definitive plan for where you should be spending your time to help the child. It used to be about a 20-minute test, and they reissued it. Now it's about a 40-minute test. So schools tend not to use that until they've already done a screener and done some intervention, and it's still too slow, and then they go back and they use the C-top to see what don't we know that we could use to fix this up. Okay, and you've seen those things right there? Where have you seen those before tonight? What are they? Those are the 4 neurological correlates of dyslexia or reading disability. That's what they look at, okay? Here are some statements by leading researchers at NICHD about how important this stuff is. It's just saying that if you believe this stuff and you use this stuff, this is stuff that works the best. Okay, early intervention. So there is one basic rule in early intervention. Once you've screened them and found out, don't wait. Do not let anybody talk you out of doing the right kind of instruction right off the bat. Schools often like to wait 6 months and do some other testing and see if this is working. We have also we had a serious problem with identifying kids with, quote, learning disabilities in this country for a long time because we mostly didn't consider identifying them until 3rd grade. Well, if it was a reading-based learning disability, way too late. And that wait became devastating for lots of kids. I'm going to show you some data in a few minutes. If you wait past 4th grade, it becomes almost impossible to remediate. So if you're not identifying them until 3rd grade, you've got a problem. So they introduced this thing called RTI. Anybody run across RTI in their school? Response to intervention. So what they like to do is say, okay, we agree with you, Mom. It looks like this kid may have a problem. We're going to try this intervention and see if he responds to it. Does he get better at it? We'll take some progress monitoring stuff. So we're going to look for about 2 or 3 months and see if he's responding to the intervention. If he's not responding, we'll try a different intervention. Then we'll go for another 2 or 3 months and see if this is working. And if that doesn't work, then we can try a more intensive intervention. We can go to Tier 3 intervention. What's happening here? Time is going by, okay? We aren't intervening instantly and immediately with the right thing. So if your kid shows low on these neurological correlates, and the school wants to take a lot of time to figure out whether what they're doing is working, and then when that doesn't work, they'll waddle time. Whoa, I have evidence. I'll show you Earl's notes. Here it is, right here, okay? We need to do this right away, not wait. They'll say, well, wait, we don't do that until we do RTI. I say, no, this is a different case. We know this kid's at high risk. We don't have the time to waste. Let's get doing the right stuff. Same test again. All right, here's data on what, this was a study done multiple times, done by the NICHD. So they wanted to know how much time it would take if you started doing the right stuff with these kids right off the bat, and what would it take if you waited a while. So here's what they found out. They took kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd graders who had similar problems in phonemic awareness and one other issue. They took a well-trained teacher in the science of reading. That teacher took 4 children in a little group, worked with them for 30 minutes a day, and guess what? At the end of 1 year, grade level, remediated. 1 teacher, 30 minutes a day, with 4 kids. That's a highly efficient use of teacher time.
How far behind are these kids?
Well, they can't be that far behind. They're K1 too. Okay. So they're yeah. Okay, so then to compare with this, they took teachers trained at the same level and took kids through the same problems. They had low phonemic awareness, low phonological processing. Of course, they'd been in school for a lot longer, so they had issues around the whole reading thing. But here's what they found out. There was still a way to get these kids back to grade level. Guess what the way was? One teacher working one-to-one for 2 hours a day for a year. How likely is that? To get those same 4 kids remediated, it took 8 hours a day from this one teacher. Doing it in K1 or 2, 30 minutes a day with one teacher for 4 kids. That's 16 times more resources to get the job done. So what this points out to us, don't wait is serious. And it's actually worse than that. See it in a minute. So what is it about the instruction that is designed to work for the kids once they're early identified and you're ready to intervene? It is explicit, carefully explained explanations of every little detail. It's intensive. You work hard on it over a long period of time with the kids. It's not incidental. It's not like, oh, I just noticed a kid in the neuro. Here, I'll explain this to him right here. It's a planned out, intensive system. It is systematic. It introduces the ideas that the child needs to learn about in a developmental sequence. The simplest things that are always the same are the things you teach first. The next group of things you teach are the things that sometimes they're this way, sometimes they're that way. Okay, sometimes OA or OU says ooh as in group, sometimes it says ow as in loud, right? So you don't do that right up front. Get all the solid stuff first, then move on to the ambiguous one, then to the more ambiguous ones after that, so you teach it systematically. It's multisensory. So the woman who developed multisensory instruction was a woman named Grace Fernald. She was she was a psychiatrist. She did a lot of work with stroke patients who had a stroke in the brain and had damaged the brain, and they had lost some function. They might have lost some of their language. They might have lost the ability to use their right hand, whatever. And her job was to work with them and try to rebuild wiring in the brain that would allow them to get that stuff back. And she found out that just showing it to them and telling it to them didn't do anything. Most classrooms are just showing it to you or telling you, okay? That's how it works. So we're not talking about, her stroke victims weren't non-intuitive, but they did have brain differences that meant they couldn't learn it the regular way. And she found out the same thing the classroom teachers find out, trying to help these children who have, let's say, dyslexia, by teaching them the regular way, showing them and telling them, doesn't work. So she found out that if you invoke other sensory systems that light up other parts of the brain, that get other parts of the brain engaged, the outcome was much better. And so that is not the visual and not the auditory. It's to use tactile, you're right, fingers touching and feeling, and it's to use kinesthetic, whole body movement, big muscle movement. If you can incorporate kinesthetic and tactile with auditory and visual, you have what is called multisensory. But most people who think they're doing multisensory haven't been well trained. They do one sense, they tell them, and do another sense, show it to them. Then they do another sense, do some tactile stuff, and another one kinesthetic stuff. Guess what? Doing it serially doesn't matter. It's doing it simultaneously. When you do it simultaneously, your auditory memory is doing the best it can to remember it from the auditory input. Your visual memory is doing the best it can to remember it. Your kinesthetic memory, which is very powerful, is adding its piece in and memorizing it in its own part of the brain. And your tactile part of your brain is working. So now you got a whole bunch of places of the brain lit up learning this stuff. So that was her system, and it worked really well with stroke victims. She is the person who taught this to a woman named Annie Sullivan. Some of you might remember who the heck she is. She's the woman who taught Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf and couldn't speak. She taught Helen Keller to read and write and become a famous speaker in America. And she did it using visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile stuff together at the same time. That's powerful stuff, okay? If the teachers who are in favor of the friction stuff think it's hard to teach this to a dyslexic kid, What if they were trying to teach a kid who's blind and deaf and had no oral language? Now, that's hard. And yet, multisensory worked there. And Dr. Samuel Orton and Annie Gillingham, the people who invented the Orton-Gillingham method for teaching dyslexic kids to read, Sam Orton borrowed Grace Fernald's simultaneous multisensory method, and that's what Orton-Gillingham is based on, in addition to these other crucial components up here. It's also diagnostic and prescriptive. When we recommend screening or C-topping kids right at the bat, what are we doing? We're diagnosing. And once we get a diagnosis, then we're prescribing what do you need to do. This kid's very low in phonemic awareness. What do you need to do to build up the phonemic awareness? That's the prescription. And that's the kind of teaching that works for the guys. Not, oh, we screened him, we know he's low. Okay, we're going to do what this book says. We're going to have him in this book over here. You got to do what you're doing and target it right at the right place. Okay, so the bottom piece is that when you're doing the right kind of teaching, you take every one of these things that we just talked about, you assess every place where there's a deficit, and you do the kind of teaching that allows you to build the neural networks in that area till they have mastery of that thing. And then, guess what? You move up to the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. That's the difference between the friction method and what's called structured literacy, teaching the structure. Okay, so here's your normal reader. Got the left hemisphere busy up here, right hemisphere, very little going on. Here's the kid with reading deficits. The lights are basically out in the left hemisphere. The kid's working like crazy, trying to get this stuff over here that is not built for reading, trying to tune that into the reading. Here's what happens if you do the right kind of teaching. Here is a dyslexic child, hardly anything going on in the left hemisphere, bunch of the stuff going on the right hemisphere. They get Orton-Gillingham intensive, systematic, multisensory phonics instruction done in a diagnostic and multisensory way. And after that intervention, tell me what you see in the left hemisphere. What happened there?
All lit up.
We built new networks, the networks work, and now the kid is using the right turf to learn to read. And look at what happened over here. What did we do over here? We diminished the amount of work that's going on over there. We rewired the brain. And so this is a huge thing about fMRIs. We were always guessing that this is what was happening, but we couldn't prove it to anybody. When you can see these pictures, you know it's happening. So what has been scientifically proven to work? These are the names of the kinds of instructions that work. Whoops, back up here. So you got Lindemood Bell, which is evolved out of the speech-language community, and it teaches structured language in exactly the right way, and it even used lots of kinesthetic and tactile stuff about what goes on in your mouth, what the speech-language people call your speech parts. It's how it looks and how it feels when you use all this stuff. And so they refer to letters as being, there's certain letters in language when they teach kids, they teach these are the lip poppers. So the letter P is a lip popper. So when you teach that kid, you're teaching them the kinesthetic feeling of what it feels like when you make the P sound, right? Very kinesthetic and tactile. All right, so then you got Orton-Gillingham, and nowadays there are that's actually about 15 or 18 of these programs derived from Orton-Gillingham. They're all written by very skillful Orton-Gillingham practitioners who have their own slightly little variants they were working on, that they really work. Those are the things that work. And you notice that one of those is the Orton-Gillingham derived code breakers that Lawrence put together to be their tool for doing this kind of instruction for these children. This is one of the few schools I know of in the country, about 300 schools like Lawrence in the country, like the school where I used to be the head, and this is the only school I know of that took the trouble to take the Orton-Gillingham stuff and wrap it around what they do as instruction here at their school. So it's really quite an accomplishment on Lawrence's part. And again, we see the same list: explicit, intensive, systematic, multisensory, diagnostic, prescriptive instruction on every one of those skill sets in a carefully sequenced way. So here are factors that may play a role in how a proven instruction is being applied. What if they're doing Orton-Gillingham, but all they did was go to Michigan and get a one-weekend training in Orton-Gillingham? Don't laugh. It's happened a lot. There is an outfit in Michigan run by a lady named Susan Barton, who swears up and down that when people come and spend a weekend there, they're a trained Orton-Gillingham specialist. In the real world, it takes a full year, over 100 hours of direct instruction and classroom observation to reach the lowest level of certification in the Orton-Gillingham. It takes 300 hours of that kind of instruction and supervision to get to a place where you are empowered to practice this independently without further supervision. So a weekend doesn't do it. So one of the things you need to ask somebody to say, well, we're doing Wilson with your kid. You want something that's this kind of stuff? We're doing it. It's Wilson. Don't just say, oh, and walk out. They're doing Wilson. Say, what level of certification does the teacher have in Wilson? It might be a 2-week workshop. Not good enough. Or you could say, how do I know that the way they're implementing the Wilson stuff is the way it's designed to be implemented? Because some people do Wilson but don't do it the right way, and guess what? It doesn't work. Okay? How often are they doing it? There's a school district near my home in Columbus that swears up and down they have the solution to all these darn reading problems, all as you give them 30 minutes of Wilson once a week. Well, guess what? 30 minutes of work on those neurons you're trying to build up here, it doesn't create any new connections. It's not enough. It's got to be 30 minutes, 5 days a week. So you look at either, if you're going to do the frequency, it's going to be 4 days a week, do it 30 minutes. If it's going to be 3 days, you want 45. Otherwise, you may actually be doing the right stuff, but not enough of it to challenge the brain to build new axons and dendrites and connect to new neurons in the neighborhood and build a network that fires properly. So those are good questions, right? Often what happens when children get identified is the school districts will intensify the regular stuff they're doing. You just get more of the friction method. Doesn't work. Okay, how come the traditional methods don't work? Okay, because most of the traditional methods assume that when a student shows up in their class, they come in already equipped with the phonemic awareness, the phonological memory, the phonological processing, the rapid retrieval that they need to learn this stuff easily. It is a fundamental assumption that the folks who adhere to that way of thinking about reading, they believe that that's how kids are. Remember, like I said this earlier, they believe that learning to read is the same as learning to talk. Just be around a lot of people who are reading and let them read to you a lot, and guess what? You know it. But what we've learned tonight is, well, not if you don't have this, not if you don't have this, and not if you don't have that. If you don't have that, you got to build it. So the friction method can work okay with about 60% of the relatively intuitive learners, not so much for the other guys. Okay, so research-proven instruction, how does it differ from whole language, from leveled literacy intervention, LLI, very, very popular in the public schools now. Another one's called balanced instruction. That means we do a little bitty bit of that stuff they talk about on the dyslexia side, so we balance it out, we put a little of that stuff in on top of all of the regular friction stuff we're doing. Okay, so all of those things don't work, and why don't they work? Number one, it assumes the kids are bringing the pieces to the party that they don't have. Okay, so how is this different? It has already been tested by NICHD. It has already been validated with thousands and thousands of students that if you get the kids with the low phonemic awareness or the other deficits and you do this kind of instruction, they learn it. So it's not up for argument about whether it's the right stuff to build that thing. Warning, the popular approaches, such as balanced literacy, LLI, reading recovery, there are approaches that are largely based on the false core conceptual belief of the whole language fans And that belief is that learning to read is essentially the same neurological process as learning to talk, and you don't have to mess around with trying to build the brain. Just do it for a while and it works. Those other methods do not include multisensory instruction, appropriate multisensory instruction. When you think about multisensory, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, remember Grace Renaud, Annie Sullivan, and who? Ellen Keller. Remember that. That stuff works. So those approaches, the friction method does not include that. So any amount that fails to provide substantial amounts of time needed for the targeted practice to develop the neural networks simply isn't going to get the job done. This is what we were talking about earlier. If your school wants to use an intervention assistance team or response to intervention, you have to remember that if you're not seeing improvement right off the bat, these are the things you want to have happening for your child. Said this a dozen times tonight. Anything works with the 60% who are relatively intuitive, and nothing works for the other bunch if it isn't the right stuff, because it doesn't build the brain components that are needed. So what's so different? It starts by assuming that any student they work with may be low in any one of these underlying neurological capacities. It screens first to find out if that's true. Then it diagnoses the low areas. Then it seeks to employ the methods that have been proven to build the neurology that makes it work. And then it provides frequent measures of progress so you know if you stalled out or whether you're still making the appropriate progress. I spent some time at the beginning trying to convince you that the data I was going to cite in this presentation is derived from the 35 years with 100,000 students from the NICHD. It's not arguable. That is actually proven scientific fact. So I wanted you to know that when you look at this data, you're working with stuff that is the way it actually is. The earlier you identify these children, the quicker, easier, more accurate, inexpensive it is. So this is my summary. We're wrapping it up here. Early identification programs, early intervention programs for at-risk readers. At multiple school districts, now some districts are adopting this stuff, in numerous states have demonstrated the capacity of these efforts, the early identification, early intervention with proper instruction, to prevent at-risk readers from becoming failures. And early intervention, the other piece about it is it spares the child the agony of being the kid in the classroom who can't read, knowing that all the other kids are getting it, and then seeing for themselves that they aren't the right one. That is devastating and harmful to the kids. So a group of us got together and worked with the state legislature. We wanted the state to implement a test of these ideas: early identification, early intervention, and intervention with the appropriate kind of instruction. So we got a law passed that resulted in a thing called the Ohio Dyslexia Pilot Project. It was a 3-year project. It was completed a couple years ago. They got 8 public school districts to join and do it. What they had to agree was they're going to screen kindergartners, a certain number of kindergartners in the district. Anybody who showed up with a red flag, they were going to then start intervention right away, and then the intervention they were going to use were going to be the kinds of things that have been demonstrated tonight, that the stuff that really works. At the end of 3 years, this is the study, the result study. Okay. In 2013, this is the group of the first group to enter kindergarten. Okay. This group, 22% rose to 61%. These are the children who were at or below, reading it wrong, at or above benchmark, grade benchmark. 22% were at or above. In the second year, that went to almost 25%, and the third year, 61%. These were the children who at the beginning were well below grade level benchmark. And over those 3 years, that's 50% went down to 21%. This is the second year of the study. children who were in there for only 2 years. They were in there for kindergarten and first grade, and then here's the third year down here. What was happening here was these teachers were learning they were being trained how to do this instruction, and they continued with the identification. What do we see as the results in the second 2 years? 37% were well below. At the end of 2 years, only 19% well below. The ones who were at above, 25%, up to 58%. And in the final year, the numbers were 7.4% well below, 76% at or above. What does that tell us? In public school districts that have never learned anything about this before, preliminary training on how to screen, preliminary training on how to implement appropriate instruction. What happened here? The low guys got better, and the guys who were bad, I thought, got a lot less. And then one of the concerns would always be, well, that'll cost too much money, and we don't have the money to do that. Guess what? This is the amount of money those districts saved by being in this project. Well, how did they save the money? Because state law in Ohio says if you are at the end of second grade or the beginning of third grade and testing indicates that you're probably not going to pass the third grade reading guarantee test, they have to provide you with intensive one-to-one instruction. That's expensive. What you're seeing here, they had so many fewer kids who needed that they saved all that money. So what do we know about early intervention and early application of appropriate stuff? A, it works way better than what they're doing, right? We've got the stuff we got the really low bad scores down to below 20% or below. And what else do we know? It's cheaper. So it's hard to see what the problem is with this proposal. Why isn't everybody doing it? Is anybody out there thinking that at the moment? Yeah. Individual school districts are now doing it. A school district in Columbus has started doing it. They got in trouble. The parents sued them for denying the children their civil rights by not applying the stuff we're talking about tonight. And they lost the suit. And consequently, some of the people who didn't want to do this stuff left the district. They brought new people in, and now they're doing it. And initially, they had 34 kids not passing the third grade reading guarantee on their first try. And after the second year, 0 kids didn't pass it on the first try. Same thing, public school district. And instead of trying to train a whole bunch of people how to be the great Orton Gillingham instructors, they went to the Wilson system and got an early program that you can put into schools in kindergarten, first, and second grade that targets phonemic awareness, because that's the biggest single issue. It is an intensely rich phonemic awareness program, and it's sort of a scripted program. And so they didn't have to retrain everybody to be an Orton Gillingham teacher. They just got some training and put in the Wilson Foundation system for K1, 2, and none of those kids failed to pass on their first try. So there are multiple solutions. Okay, when we have this kind of evidence, and we think about the title of this presentation, why wait for failure? When we have this evidence, we have this is what the child looks like before we do this, and this is what the child looks like after we do this. And when the self-image and the school success, and quite possibly the life success of our own child, or for a teacher of our own student, is at great risk if we don't do this. If that's another condition, why the hell should we wait? That's the end. I will stick around for anybody who wants to stick around and talk and ask questions and that kind of stuff. If you want to stay around and ask questions to the audience, that's fine. If the people are ready to go, you're going to pack up and head out, go ahead. I'll just come down here and stand, and I'll take questions, and we can talk. So what do you want to do? If you want to holler them out from the audience, just do so. We'll go there. Anybody's got to go home can go home. Thanks for being here. I enjoyed sharing this with you, and I hope you can put it to work for your kid and in your school. Remember, I'm about half deaf, so you got to really... Oh, do we have a mic? Oh, you're so good. That's great. There we go.
Hello? Yep.
Oh, okay. Oh, real close.
Okay.
My son has autism spectrum disorder.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if this would work with my child, and how would I get the school district to implement this?
Okay, I can't speak with expertise about that. In general, one of the core elements of this is the simultaneous multisensory teaching. And I think most autism organizations employ some component of that. I don't know if they're doing early screening on the reading stuff. And I would suspect a lot of kindergartners, maybe first or second graders, maybe they aren't reading well enough to be screened. I don't know. So that's not my field of expertise, but you can take this information to them and ask them. Maybe, is there someone else here who knows the answer to that about would this work with autistic kids? Okay, sorry, I can't help you on that one. Yes, ma'am.
My son is also on the spectrum and is dyslexic and a number of other things.
Right.
And it's was great for him.
Oh, great.
Yes.
It took a lot to get him to the point to get here.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, I have a question. You said for response to intervention to get like data after 6 weeks to see if it's working. How much improvement would you want to see? Like if there was 1 percentile improvement, would that indicate that it's working, or do you need to see a certain?
So then what you need to know is you need to know the C-top scores on this kid or the screener scores.
Okay.
You've got to know where he started and where he is now. So you want to retest on that. So maybe the ball hasn't moved at all on his field. Or maybe there's been a very, very little increment. So you have to ask yourself, is the increment I'm seeing something I should be satisfied with or that the school should be satisfied with? Once you know how far behind he is, you can say, well, if he gains this much every year, how many years will it be till he's caught up?
Okay.
So if he's gaining 1/10 of a year of skill every year, and he's 2 years behind, it's going to be 20 years until he catches up at that rate. So you do this, you can't do a little, and ask the school, tell them, you want to do a sort of rate of gain. Tell me what his rate of gain is going to play out to on when he hits grade level. They should be able to tell you that. So that's what you want to know, rate of gain. Okay. If the rate of gain is going to have him on grade level in 2 years or 3 years, hey, that's better than what it was going to be by far, right? It'd be great if it would be all done in 1 year, but a lot of kids are slow to remediate. It takes time to build this neurological stuff. You can't do it by snapping your fingers. So that's the key piece. Talk to them about rate of gain. Tell them, I want to know, at this rate of gain, when will he be where he needs to be?
Okay.
You know, if it's 2 decades, and we got to speed it up here.
Well, he's only in first grade, so he's only 1 year behind.
Yep. Yep. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
That answer? All right, just write that down. Remember that term, rate of gain,
Yes.
because that's the crucial piece. Most schools will see a kid who hasn't been gaining at all, and then they start doing some stuff, and the kid makes 1/4 of a year of gain. They say, yay, we're gaining, problem solved. Well, not exactly. It's going to be 10 years till he gets there. So you got to go back and measure, is the rate of gain going to get us there?
Well, they had him on 3 days a week of intervention, and then they just moved to 5 days a week.
That's a step in the right direction. Good. All right. And what do they use for progress monitor? Is it Ames Web or Dibbles? What do they use? Okay, so you should know. They're both pretty good progress monitors. I mean, once you get the information from your screener or from the C-top, you know what the real scores are. Yes.
That sounds like Ames
They
Web.
measure fluent command of the things they're learning in the reading. Yep. And then you want to track that, and you want to ask them to demonstrate to you why that's the appropriate rate of progress.
Okay.
Fortunately, almost all the schools use Ames Web or Dibbles, and they're both pretty good monitors, and they're all kind of quick to administer, so it's not a huge burden to do it. So
Yes, I would definitely make sure that they're doing it frequently.
They're doing it every other week.
Okay, that's good. Sometimes people will wait and they'll do it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you could check in with them and find out if they can provide you with those scores more frequently, like on a monthly basis. But at least they're checking every other week. Some schools wait like semester to semester, which isn't a particularly good, dipstick into what's going on.
Other questions here? Anybody need a mic?
Just chatting. Okay. Well, we are going to end the conversation at this point, but it sounds like you'll be available if you just want to chat for another couple minutes, and your contact information is available as well. Our updated slides will be provided in an email to all the participants as well.
So give me some feedback. Did I convince you? Do you buy the arguments I was making?
Yes.
Okay. That's what I needed to know.
My thought is always, how do we get more people at these type of things? That's always my thing. Like, I think of so many people who are administrators. Exactly.
So I work with school districts. I work with parent advocacy groups in a number of school districts. And the parents are now the ones who are responsible for developing expertise in this field. And you do that by coming to presentations like this and finding out where else you got to go look and learn about NICHS stuff. So what is happening in a lot of school districts, like what happened in Upper Arlington, the one I told you about it right at the end there, is that parents are becoming more knowledgeable about the law and more knowledgeable about the science than the school people.
Yes.
And they go in armed with that data, and they bring in the publications to support it and say, well, you're not doing it, here's what it says, and we would like to get you to, how can we work with you to get that to happen?
We also want you to know that we'll produce a professional video of tonight, exactly what you sat through, and provide it on our website. And we are happy to have you take it and show it to those administrators, show it to other parent advocacy groups. Earl is very willing to come and speak with those people, and Lawrence is willing to be seriously a convener. You promise us some more people at a different time, we'll help you with that presentation. For now, though, like Dr. Christian said, I think we're gonna wrap it up. Because Halloween was last night, and we're all wet inside.
So thank you all for being here. I really feel great about having the chance to share this with you, and I hope it turns out that it's better for your kid and that you get the schools to make it better for the other kids too.